Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our MnSTAC forum, A View from Minnesota Woods. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just had an announcement from the Minnesota Society of Arboriculture. They wanted to remind everyone of the fall conference that's coming up. It'll be on October 19th from 8 a.m. until 4 p.m. It's at the University of Minnesota. It'll be at our education center here. And the title or the theme is Homegrown Minnesota Experts and Minnesota Topics. So you can go to, and I'll post the link here in the chat. So if you're interested in attending or seeing who's going to be speaking, you'll have that. So that's in the chat. All right, so let me introduce our speaker for today. We have Dr. Eli Sagor. Eli manages the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative based out of the Cloquet Forestry Center in Cloquet, Minnesota. He primarily addresses forest ecology and management with a focus on climate adaptation and forest resilience. Eli has led many workshops, conferences, webinars, so it's really great to have him here. And I don't want to take up any more of his time. So Eli, thank you for being here. And yeah, we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Eric. I'm glad to be here. I'm not frequently in touch with MnSTAC or involved with MnSTAC, but I have great respect for the organization. I think you all do really important work, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm an extension specialist. I am based up at the Cloquet Forestry Center, as I think Eric said, and my work is in the woods. We always struggle with what's the right, is it urban forest? Urban forest is clear, but or community forests, but what are the woods? Rural forests, or I don't think traditional forestry is the right term. Whatever is the right term, that's what I'm mostly going to be talking about today. So my plan is to go through some of the issues and some things that are going on in the Minnesota woods. I am thinking that I'm talking mainly to an urban forestry audience. And I'm going to close the talk with some of my thoughts on what I think are some real needs for us to broaden the gray area between these many different sort of subfields within forestry, urban and otherwise. And I really hope that we can have a bit of a conversation about that. And I want to encourage you to use the chat actively. I'd love to see you post questions there anytime. I'll be keeping sort of one eye on the chat, but Eric is going to help me with that a little bit too. And I really would love to encourage you to view this as a conversation rather than just a dump of information from me. And to start with that, I'm going to ask you to do something now. If you would type into the chat and just tell me briefly, what kind of work do you do and where? What part of the state if you're in Minnesota, or where on the globe if you're not. And I said before that I assume I'm talking to a little bit more of an urban forest oriented audience, but I probably shouldn't assume that. Great, thanks Rachel, municipal forester in St. Paul. I'm talking to you today from the St. Paul campus, so not too far away. Great, thanks Ryan. Community Forest Education, Apple Valley, Chanhassen. I'm married to a Kerber who is from Chanhassen. Jill Kerber Boulevard, I think, is named after their family some generations back. I don't know how many. Arborist for Stearns Electric. Hey Ginger, good to see you here. Master Naturalist. Tim Taylor, wonderful. Okay, great. So Forester Natural Resource Specialist for Robbinsdale. Terrific. Thanks to all of you. I really appreciate that. And as I said before, I encourage you to respond to things I've said. If there's anything that's unclear, use the chat actively. Don't hesitate to do that. So let's see if I can advance my slides. I wanted to mention, so we're going to be spending our time kind of in the woods today, at least in a manner of speaking. And I wanted to mention that the slides are available. I shared the link earlier, but the slides are available for you to look at as we go through or later. The URL is here. Thanks, Eric, for putting that in the chat again. And you can refer to those, do whatever you want with those slides at your leisure. So I'm going to talk first, the main part of my talk, what's going on in the Minnesota woods. And then I'm going to talk about urban and rural forestry connections, as I said. So the themes I'm going to address are climate change, forest management, carbon, and adaptation. There's a lot more going on than that, but those are the big themes that I'm going to be addressing. And again, we're going to see a lot of overlap and interaction for obvious reason between sort of rural and urban forests. Thanks, William and Dana, for entering your, telling me a bit about yourself too. I appreciate that. So context. Minnesota, I didn't grow up in Minnesota. I grew up way east of here. And I just find Minnesota endlessly fascinating, Minnesota's ecology and geography. We know that the state is diverse, but it really is diverse on a continental scale. We're fortunate to have to exist in one of the most diverse places. We have three of the major continental biomes represented within Minnesota. You all are familiar with this, the basics of this, but the Laurentian mixed forests, the deciduous, the kind of the big woods, and the prairies out to the west and south. About a third of Minnesota is forest. It's relatively diverse in the way that I just briefly explained. The northern and eastern parts of the state are most heavily forested, and as you get up into places like the Boundary Waters and the Arrowhead, of course, we see more coniferous and mixed forests. As we get a little bit west and south, more deciduous and kind of central hardwoods and so on, mixing out into prairie and savanna systems to the west and south. Minnesota's forests are important to us, not just ecologically, but in other ways as well. The wood products industry, broadly defined, is Minnesota's 5th largest manufacturing sector. So it's not too far behind agriculture and some others. It's a hugely important economic engine in the state. And it is a lot of that activity occurs in greater Minnesota, in small towns and rural communities outside the large metropolitan areas. Estimated $17.8 billion in gross sales every year. But beyond dollar signs, it also supports a tremendous diversity of wildlife, a lot of recreational activity, supports water quality. I don't mention carbon right here, but it's a tremendously important carbon stock and source of carbon sequestration, which I will talk about in a little bit too. So forests really are not only the backdrop to a lot of what we do in Minnesota, but are really, really important to the ways we live our lives. Minnesota's forests are owned, I think this is a subject for another day, but I think the ownership distribution is really interesting and in some ways really optimal in order to promote climate adaptation and both a mix of diverse ownership, which leads to diverse management actions, and some very large ownerships that enable management at scale, coordinated management. But 23–24% of Minnesota's forest land is owned by the state of Minnesota. A little under 12% by the federal government. That's Voyageurs National Park and 2 national forests, the Superior and the Chippewa. Counties, unlike most states, counties are very important landowners and land managers. Pretty aggressive land managers with the intent and goal to produce revenue to support schools and other local government operations. Families and individuals are the largest single category of ownership. So people who own hunting land, cabins with acreage, that sort of thing out around the state collectively own 37%. Corporate and other private tally about another 12% in total, putting private ownership just under 50% of Minnesota's forests. So again, 3 large individual entities or groups. There are 13 counties that collectively own that share, enabling management, coordinated management at scale, but then a whole lot of small landowners out there too. The number of families and individuals, depending on how small you go, my half acre doesn't count in the suburbs. But if you go down to 1 or 2 acres of wooded land, there are about 200,000 of them. So fewer of them than homeowners, of the kinds of people that many of you deal with on a daily basis, but still a tremendously large audience. I mentioned climate. Minnesota's mean annual temperature is changing at a fairly rapid rate. So mean annual temperature is the average temperature across the entire year. If you look back to our earliest measured temperature records, this is not based on ice cores and things like that. This is measurements of thermometers. We see about a 2 degree Fahrenheit per decade increase in average temperature in Minnesota. If you prefer Celsius, that's about 1 degree Celsius in total over that period of time. But the big change is happening in winter, and the scales, I didn't create these charts. The scales this looks like a less steep curve, but it's actually a steeper change. Our winter temperatures are warming at a much rapid rate, about twice that rate, 4 degrees Fahrenheit per decade, or a total of about 2 degrees Celsius in the last 125 years or so. So we're seeing change all year round, but most of that change is driven, the summers haven't changed much. Most of that change is driven by milder, warmer winters. And you already know from emerald ash borer and other things, but this has some really important implications for the state of our trees and our forests. In addition to changes in temperature, we're also seeing other changes. Some of those are changes that we've largely brought about. I just love this picture. I find this absolutely beautiful. Some people would think that's funny, but this is the Pagani Creek burn area in the Boundary Waters. This is 2 years after it burned. So I took this picture. I think that fire was 2011. This picture was 2013. Fire, most of our forests are fire dependent. Especially most of the forests in the north and east part of the state. And that means that they were shaped by, over millennia, fire, very frequent fire that was much more frequent than it is now. Since about 100 years ago, give or take, depending on where you are, we have suppressed fire. We have made it illegal to start wildfires, which most of those fires in history, as far as we can tell, and there's increasing evidence for this all the time, were started by people. Some of them, a very small share, by lightning, and these fires, this natural disturbance, really played a major role in shaping our forests. So when we stop fire, we see some really big changes. Some of those changes are clearly evident in stands like this. This picture was taken at the Cloquet Forestry Center, a stand called Camp 8. If you've visited the Cloquet Forestry Center, there's a good chance you've been in this stand. If you haven't, I encourage you to go there. The Cloquet Forestry Center is a beautiful place, nice trails, 2 hours north of the Twin Cities. And it's a fascinating place to learn about forests. So you can see, you don't need me to point it out, but you can see that the trees coming in to replace these dying red pines are not red pines. This system is changing, and it's changing largely because of the suppression of fire. So Eric, that's a great link. I appreciate your putting that in, but I'm going to type another one, the Camp 8 story. z.umn.edu/camp8. The reason I'm putting this one in instead, I'm sorry, it's not a live link, but that's what you get on the fly. The reason I put that one in, that's a great story written by Claire Borigter a couple of years ago about the history of fire and really the history of this Camp 8 stand. I really encourage you to check it out. It's just terrific. But because we've suppressed fire, we've really changed the way these systems work. And that leads to changes in species composition, changes in natural resource, ecological processes in these systems. And it opens the door to a number of pests and pathogens as well. So is that bad or is it good? I'm sure not I'm not going to be the person, especially on the heels of the Greenwood Lake fire, to say that we shouldn't be suppressing fire. And on the other hand, we do need to recognize the changes that these things are bringing and the implications of those changes for things that we value. And I would, although I won't right now, I really do advocate for returning fire, controlled fire, to our forests. I think that's something we really need to do and would create many benefits for us if we did. Let me find my clicker here. Invasive species, we see these all the time. On the left side, this picture, I took this in Marina and St. Croix at an event that I did with DNR a few years ago. The left side, the buckthorn has been cleared. On the right side, it has not. There's a property line running through the middle of the picture. Buckthorn and other species like it, reed canary grass, which is, we think, now native, and many other invasives are really changing the ways that these systems function. Invasive species presence combined with some of these other changes, fire suppression, warmer conditions, and so on, are leading to some real challenges and changes in how our forests work. That means foresters need to do things differently, invest more money and time and effort in regenerating stands because they're not regenerating. In other words, starting new trees after a harvest or other disturbance. It's costing more and it's more difficult to regenerate stands. And invasives create other issues as well. Big invasive species. What are the invasives on your minds? Let's go back to the chat. I'll give you one gimme. If I didn't, I'm sure it would be the first one typed in. But what are the big invasive species that you see? Emerald ash borer is the gimme. That's, I'm sure, the biggest one. But as an urban forestry community, or drawing on your experience or knowledge of rural forests, what do you think are the biggest invasives that we're dealing with? Yeah, my goodness, garlic mustard, buckthorn. We can get a few more than that. Black locust. I'm glad to hear that. My goodness, black locust has just taken over in a lot of places near where I live, and we had a small infestation at the forestry center too. That I'm glad we controlled this year. Japanese knotweed, Norway maple, and Amur maple. Thanks, Tina. Great. So yeah, there are a bunch of these. Yeah, I think black locust is overlooked. I'm not quite sure why it doesn't get more attention. Buckthorn, and I guess I'm guilty of it too. I didn't put it on my list here, but buckthorn, and that has relationships to soybean aphid. And so where we see buckthorn on the edge of the forest trending into ag, buckthorn is the alternate host for soybean aphid. That's the relationship there. So where you have buckthorn, so you tend to have worse soybean aphid outbreaks. Emerald ash borer, eastern larch beetle, that's a native insect. Yeah, flowers are too pretty. You might be right, Tina. They are beautiful and they smell good. It's what follows the flowers, the seeds, that are the problem. Yeah, reed canary. Garlic mustard, gypsy moth, which we're seeing more and more of. It's still not a major disturbance agent here in Minnesota. Knapweeds and tansy and other plant non-woodies. Deer. Now, I may be using the term invasives a little bit broadly. Deer, certainly, white-tailed deer are native, although they previously were at much lower populations and coexisted with elk, at least in parts of the state. But all of these things are getting more and more attention, and necessarily so, by foresters who are concerned about the ways that they're impacting those systems. Oriental bittersweet is another one that is a cause of alarm. So foresters are dealing with these things to varying degrees, certainly more than they used to. And invasives are not a problem because of their mere presence. They're a problem because they change ecosystems. And all of these things, I mentioned earlier that eliminating fire leads to changes in ecosystem processes. Yeah, honeysuckle too. Thanks, Rachel. The lack of fire, and it's hard to implicate, I don't know exactly to what degree fire is responsible for this, but certainly fire is a factor in the increasing, the lack of fire is a factor in the increasing importance of fungal pathogens like Diplodia and Serococcus, collectively referred to as shoot blights. The picture that you see on the right is a shoot blight affecting red pine, very common. And because of this, because of how serious this problem is, you basically cannot now regenerate red pine after, well, in a situation where you have mature red pines in the same stand. So you might think about a partial harvest of red pine, and then you're going to plant or rely on natural seed fall to establish red pine in the understory. That's would have been very, very common before. Red pine is fire dependent, but fires don't tend to kill all trees. They leave some standing as a, and then those trees drop seed. But we can't regenerate stands that way anymore because most foresters are really concerned about stand stocking. In other words, having a high enough stocking level of new regeneration, enough of them per acre that you'll be fully occupying the growing space. And mortality rates from these shoot blights are high enough that you just can't do that. Sometimes this problem is overstated, but it's certainly an issue. And the conventional wisdom in the forestry community is what I just said. You basically can't do this if you're concerned about producing a commercial timber crop. Earthworms have changed the nature and properties of soils. Deer have, become, because of their higher population levels, a bigger disturbance agent. Emerald ash borer, by taking out just about all the ash, as you know, and you all may know more about this than me, there's a small glimmer of hope in research out of Michigan. Kathleen Knight, I think, is the person leading that or involved in that. That is helping us to think that some ash maybe might come through. Eastern larch beetle, that's absolutely right. And Jennifer, that Eastern larch beetle is native. And I said earlier, I'm using some of these terms a little bit loosely. Eastern larch beetle absolutely is native. The reason it's causing a problem now, and it's causing very widespread problems, is that the longer growing season is leading to a doubling of its population. They're able to complete almost 2 full generations in a growing season, where they never could before. And if you're familiar with exponential or geometric rates of population growth, you know that that's a huge factor. And so they're overwhelming our native tamarack, which they never overwhelmed them before. So you're right, Jennifer, and some of these other things, the fungal shoot blights that I mentioned earlier are likely native, at least some of them as well. But and deer are too. But the ways that these ecosystems, I mean, their presence and their prevalence within these systems are really leading to changes from the way these systems used to work before. And that has big implications for forest management. This is a picture I took up on the Chippewa National Forest. There's some really great research happening up there into forest dynamics and silviculture and systems like this. And this picture I put in because I talked a little bit earlier about challenges now with growing red pine under red pine, namely the mortality that comes from the presence of these shoot blights. Well, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but many of our pine-dominated forests ecologically would have actually been woodland communities and not what we think of as densely populated forest communities. This is particularly true in the northern and western parts of Minnesota's forest. In other words, the area around the Chippewa National Forest. Brian Palak, who's a silviculture researcher based there, he's with the Northern Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service, has been working very closely with the Leech Lake Band and others to look into restoring this woodland community. So woodland, as opposed to forest, simply refers to wider spaced, maybe not as widely spaced as a savanna, but definitely lower stocking levels, more open space between trees, less competition for water. Now, most eastern forests, and by eastern forests, I mean all of our forests in Minnesota, eastern continental forests, I mean, in general, light is a bigger factor in reducing in competition between trees. In other words, you can grow as many trees in a given area as there is light to support them. Eventually they shade one another out and competition happens and trees die, but light tends to be the driver. But now, and in Western forests, water is a much bigger factor, especially in the Intermountain West. And so in those systems, you end up with not light being the primary limiting factor, but water, underground competition being a limiting factor. Can't generalize too much, but it's much more common in the West than it is in the East. But in extraordinary drought years like now, that changes, and we're seeing more and more of that change now. Why does this matter? Well, in a woodland community, you have trees that are more widely spaced. When trees are more widely spaced, there's less competition for water. And when there is less competition for water, trees tend to be more vigorous and able to withstand and survive, withstand disturbance and survive. So Brian and the Leech Lake foresters and many others are really looking into and developing a deeper understanding of how these woodland communities work. And the benefits ecologically of having wider spacing, lower stocking levels, and so on. Does that mean that all of our forests should be like that? No, of course not. Timber production would be much lower where you have lower stocking levels. And that's a really important value of our forests, but not on every acre everywhere. That has never been the goal. And again, just some really interesting work that's happening in the realm of all of these changes that we're observing. I'm not going to stop talking right now, but I am going to pause for just a moment. And if I see a couple of comments, please feel free to, if you have, as I said earlier, but if you have questions for me, go ahead and type those in at any time. I'm really happy to be interrupted, and so I encourage you to do that. Another change that we're seeing that affects both people and our ecosystems is warmer winters. A lot of the northern forests in Minnesota, especially peatland forests that occur on peatlands, can only be managed, by which I really mean harvested basically, in the winter when the ground is frozen. Warmer winters mean that the ground is frozen for a shorter period of time. And that has implications for our ability to get in and manage these forests. So this is a black spruce, predominantly black spruce stand that you see here. Why is somebody plowing a road in the middle of the woods, for goodness sake? Well, they're doing that because snow is an insulator. And this is very commonly done to help roads and help soils freeze down. Loggers will go in early in the season and plow out and remove the snow so that they get a deeper freeze more quickly. So why do I mention this? Well, big deal. Loggers need to go out and plow more. But it also affects our ability to even get into these stands. And there have been several winters recently where we can't do that. Okay, that affects forest products. It also affects forest health. Another thing, and I would speculate, and I don't have a lot of evidence for this, but black spruce, this is not a speculation, black spruce is increasingly damaged and threatened by dwarf mistletoe. Eastern spruce dwarf mistletoe has always been around. I speculate, and others do too, that its abundance and importance, both ecologically and financially, in terms of its impacts on productivity, are greater because of our success suppressing fire. And so our reduced ability to get into these stands to manage them or to burn them has fairly serious implications, again, both ecologically and in terms of stand productivity. So warmer winters, and you saw earlier that the rate of warming over the last century or so is about double, that the warming in winter is double what it is in summer. So this is a big deal. Summarizing, most of these changes make life better for invasives and really worse for native forests. And I don't need to review why. You've heard me say why. Two generations of eastern larch beetle, more dwarf mistletoe, other things too. So let's talk about forest management. Now, I said earlier, well, when I say management, I really mean harvesting. And that's kind of true, not completely, but it's kind of true. But in an environment in which we've suppressed disturbance, the primary disturbance agent of fire, forest management is really the only way that we can get in and at least mimic the effects of those natural disturbances that we've eliminated. It's also the only way to pay for, not the only way, it's the only way to pay at a large scale for interventions like buckthorn removal or other treatments to reduce the impacts of invasive species. So forest management is important, and I'll talk about that next. Eric, have we started seeing tree species composition change? Yes, absolutely. Have we seen it on a super wide scale? No. Well, maybe. Red maple has always been present in northern Minnesota. It's becoming much more abundant in northern Minnesota over the last 50, 60, 70 years. And so this time of year, and this is not going to be a great foliage year, the birches and aspens in the Boundary Waters have already dropped most of their leaves. But this year, or any year, and this time of year is what I mean to say, red maples become really easy to see in northern Minnesota, and there are many more of them now than there have been before. And that picture that I showed earlier of maple and birch invading the Camp 8 stand really illustrates that pretty plainly. When you eliminate fire, those thin-barked species that are not adapted to fire at all can gain a foothold. Again, they're always present, but if you have frequent fire, well, they get killed when the pines don't, because pines are fire adapted. And so pines will maintain seed sources and so on that'll quickly regenerate. So eliminating fire does lead to some changes. When I said earlier, not widespread, I mean, I guess what I meant is, yeah, it's not like we're seeing chinkapin oak, taking over Carleton County. But the conditions are such that we're beginning to think that we might need to help to make that happen more and more. And we are certainly observing some changes now. Thanks for the question. This slide's going to appear twice in this talk. This is a cool stand. This is an adaptive silviculture for climate change experiment stand up at the Cloquet Forestry Center, where maybe sometime in the past we would have just clear cut this stand. Now we're conducting research, and this is not this is university-owned property. We're a research institution. This is a research forest, but this is a model for the kind of thing, and we are already seeing a lot of this kind of silviculture across the landscape. What happened here is that we left some areas totally unharvested. Most of the matrix, especially on the left side, by matrix, I mean between the gaps, has been thinned. And then we've got these relatively large gaps. I think there might be a half-acre gaps that are essentially small clear cuts. And by managing like this, you create a really wide range of not only light conditions, but also moisture conditions and sun exposure and so on, light availability. And that creates a diversity of functional responses, a diversity of essentially habitats or growing conditions or growing space availability that's going to foster a more diverse stand replacing this one than what we have now. Now, okay, maybe, I'm not going to put big judgments on this, but I'm not too enthusiastic about birch and maple completely taking over for red pine, but I do see benefits, and I think it's important for us to think about increasing resilience by creating more diverse stands. Let's talk a little bit about just some numbers here. Forest area is 17 million acres, as I've already said. We do every decade, some colleagues and I do a survey of the large landowners and say, how many acres did you harvest? What we find is that they have harvested in any given year about 150,000 acres. That's 0.65% of the total forest land. Well under 1% of the forest land is touched in any one year. Of that 0.65%, most is clear cut. This is a picture of a clear cut. There are a few standing trees. This is on Cass County land. This clear cut actually wraps around the white pine that you see kind of in the background. That's a reserve patch. That's very common to see relatively large reserve patches in clear cuts like that. So most of it is clear cut. And if you're thinking about emulation of natural disturbance, this would most closely emulate either a very severe windstorm or a pretty severe fire. Again, as I said earlier, fire doesn't knock everything out completely. It tends to leave a mosaic because the intensity of the fire varies from place to place throughout the burn area. The remaining 30% of that harvest acreage is thinnings. This is a thinned red pine stand. You can see some balsam fir growing in the understory, as it frequently does. And we're gonna walk out kind of into some of these stands. The next couple of slides here are from southern Minnesota. Most of my talk and most of my photos are from northern Minnesota. But these next few pictures are from a workshop we did down near Winona, looking at floodplain forests. And a couple of people mentioned reed canary grass earlier. Holy cow! I've heard about reed canary grass being a problem, and I had no idea how intense it was, or at least I had not seen it as intensely as we did here. This is a floodplain forest that was thinned several years before and has just been completely overtaken by reed canary grass. The fellow, I can't use my pointer, I can use my cursor. This is Greg Edge, DNR, Wisconsin DNR silviculturist. Adam Foringer, DNR forester from Wisconsin, several Minnesota DNR land managers. This is Andy Meyer, floodplain forest specialist with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and several others too. And they led us around and showed us some of these stands very heavily impacted. And again, the presence of reed canary and its abundance has really changed how these floodplain forests work. It's become much harder to regenerate these stands now than it was in the past. Just another example. Reed canary, as many of you I'm sure know, produces a very kind of thick, dense root mat that's really hard. In addition to almost no light being down there, very hard to penetrate and grow through. We also visited, this is where silviculture, red pine silviculture is fun, but hardwood silviculture in southern Minnesota is really fascinating. They're much, much more diverse stands. And we had just a really great tour visiting some of these stands too, and looking at strategies they're using to deal with species like buckthorn and reed canary, which is not as big a problem in upland stands like this, but those species are nearby and are certainly species that need to be considered in silviculture planning. Oaks are cute. It just makes me happy to see white oak growing prolifically out there. There are some growing in my yard. They're fun too, but seeing it in the woods just makes me happy. And more, even stands like this historically might have been clear cut. More and more, we're seeing silviculture that includes retention of species, retention of mature trees in the harvest areas that are designed, and that's done in order to produce diverse conditions, diverse functional responses, as I said before, and to increase the species diversity and resilience of these stands. Quick, what's this a picture of? I'd love to see in the chat. What do you think? It's kind of a trick question, which I shouldn't mention, but I did. What do you think this is a picture of? Go ahead, go out on a limb. Okay, good guess. Ash, basswood. Okay, good. Both good responses. Let's get one more and then we'll move on. Toothpicks, ha. So I don't know the species. I think it's ash. I think that at least the lighter colored is ash. Ryan, maybe I'm wrong. And basswood's a good guess too. But this is a picture of carbon. I mean, obviously it's a picture of a species. And I appreciate those of you who put something in there. But carbon is a huge factor. So when we think about forests and wood products and the values that forests create, forest carbon is becoming a bigger one all the time, a more important and more front of mind consideration all the time. Wood is 50% carbon by dry weight. So carbon can get complicated, but it can also be really, really simple. So 50% carbon by dry weight. You know how heavy a log is. We've all tried to move a log around. Well, you know, if you're looking at a living tree, if you fell it, about half the weight of that tree is water. Once you get rid of the water, half of what's left is carbon. All of that carbon is from the atmosphere. So we're dealing with a crisis now of climate change, some really rapid changes that I've already talked about. Trees and forests are the best opportunity we have to mitigate that, to pull carbon actually out of the atmosphere. When trees grow, they sequester carbon. Growing and harvesting trees can be part of a climate solution. So what we need to do is, first of all, to reduce emissions. I don't mean to sidestep that at all. We really need to be taking active steps to reduce our carbon emissions. What those of us working in natural resources have control over and really can do a lot about at a larger scale is growing and harvesting trees, and understanding that any wood products, first of all, wood products that are long-lived wood products, like my desk, my shelves, flooring, stud walls, pull carbon out in their growing, and then keep carbon out of the atmosphere for decades. That's really, really important. And so forests and forest management are tremendously important as a climate solution. So harvesting trees increases, you know, and turning those trees into wood products removes that wood from the growing space, creating, you know, open areas that can promote or can lead to fast growth of new tree species and rapid rates of carbon sequestration. So I really want to make the case that we need more active forest management for a whole variety of reasons, that most of which I've already discussed. The problem is that our timber harvest statewide is down quite a bit. Now, these numbers are a little bit out of date, but the trends are more or less in keeping with what you see here. The change, the black line at the top is private, essentially. And this big drop in timber harvesting and forest management was driven by a series of mill closures in northern Minnesota in the 2000s. And so I just told you, I think we really need to do more forest management for a variety of environmental reasons, but we're doing less. So let's talk a little bit about that, and let's talk a little bit about adaptation. And I will say that there's good news with respect to this chart. We have reason to think this will go up. There's a new mill that was just announced not long ago going in Deer River. That's an oriented strand board mill that is expected to increase demand and increase, to some degree at least, the harvest level, allow us to manage more acres, pull more carbon off that land and get more carbon growing. But let's talk a bit about adaptation. Eric, you're probably getting nervous about the time. I am aware of the time, and I'll bring us in for sure by 11 with, I hope, some discussion too. So my favorite part of my job is spending days like this. That's Eric Lindquist in the middle of the picture, Cass County Land Department forester, talking about the way they manage their woods, and a variety of other people talking about and learning from Eric and the good work that they're doing, as well as from other instructors about, you know, wildlife and forest management and climate adaptation and all these different things. And we see a lot of change. Sometimes it seems like things change slowly in the forestry world, but then you look back and change is really happening. So a variety of forces are leading to increased forest adaptation or activities designed to help our forests adapt to changing conditions. A lot of research about projected changes and how to prepare. Eric, you asked a good question earlier that I didn't address about, how actively should we be thinking about assisted migration? Should we be rethinking what native or new native species, exist and should be across Minnesota? Yeah, I think we should. Managing systems, plant and community-based silviculture, attention to forest health threats, increasing resilience, and so on. I'm going to zip through these pretty quickly, but I do think it's worth mentioning them. You're now seeing this for the second time. I've already talked about changes more all the time, changes in the ways that we practice silviculture that are designed to increase the diversity and resilience of our forest systems. You all, I think, know what silviculture is, but in case you don't, it's the art and science of controlling basically the structure, composition, and growth of our forests. Silviculture is pretty fun. Managing complex ecosystems to produce the outcomes that we want. More and more, especially on state lands, we see that plant community-based silviculture is really driving what we do in the woods. It's not just, hey, what do we want to grow here? Let's grow red pine. Okay, let's do this. It's really understanding at a very deep level what's going on ecologically in these systems. And under changing conditions, we can have some really interesting discussions about, should we always be managing for essentially, what has grown here in the past? Not necessarily, and even ECS silviculture, ecosystem-based ecological classification systems can help us to understand what might change in the future. But making sure that we have the right species on the right sites is a really, really important part of what foresters are doing. And this has been pretty much very widely adopted, again, within the DNR and more in other acres as well. We have to be quickly treating forest health threats, bark beetle outbreaks, and so on. Our forests are more and more stressed all the time, and because of warming conditions and more bugs and things like that. And we need to quickly treat the threats that we see. Resilience, I've already given you a few examples of planning for uncertainty in the ways that we practice silviculture. This is an aerial photo of an experimental stand on the Chippewa National Forest. It's not the same one I showed you earlier, but it's part of the same sort of body of research. And we see more and more silviculture that's designed to look like this, to create diverse conditions within harvest areas to promote diverse responses of the next stand. This gets a little bit to Eric's question, favoring future adapted species. So DNR Forestry has produced some really nice guides to trees that are well suited to future conditions, and others have as well. NIACS, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. NIACS has a great little pocket guide, climate change field guide for northern Minnesota forests. That's just terrific and gives good guidance for how to do this. So we see a lot of this happening. It's not happening a lot at operational scales, meaning I don't see too many 500-acre plantings of ponderosa pine or whatever, but definitely do see more interest in it and desire for applied research to help understand what might and might not thrive in our future climate. Again, more and more applied research, understanding, there's a framework called resistance, resilience, and transition that helps forest land managers to understand kind of what do we do here? We could resist the effects of climate change. We could produce more resilient forests, or we could recognize that we're not going to have the same forest here in the future. We need to transition to different forest types. And there's a lot of research happening now about how to operationalize that framework. Now, this is much needed and really good. Some of that research is published by practitioners on the Great Lakes Silviculture Library. If you're interested, I encourage you to check that out. There are about 120 case studies there. For full disclosure, I run it, so maybe I'm tooting my own horn, but I do think this is a really useful way for practitioners to share what they've learned, for researchers to learn what questions they're asking and what they're learning. And I think that this kind of knowledge has been missing for too long. I think we've relied on experts exclusively too much. And I think practitioners can have a lot to contribute too, and we see that on platforms like this. So I haven't left myself too much time, but I think there's some really interesting ground to discuss urban and rural forestry connections. And I'm just going to go through, and I really encourage you to respond and to share your thoughts about this. Most foresters, not urban foresters, obviously, but rural foresters consider 20 acres a minimum manageable ownership. So if you got less than 20 acres, there's just not much you can do about it. There's the economies of scale associated with moving timber harvesting equipment. It's so expensive to move that equipment that you can't really cover your costs on a 5-acre timber harvest. So you got, from the forestry side, you got a 20-acre minimum. On the other side, arborists don't do a lot of work in the woods. I'd love you to correct me. I know that there are some exceptions, some arborists who do some work, but there's also a lot of woodland in ownerships under 20 acres. I looked at the National Woodland Owner Survey and a couple of other sources. And I estimate this is a quick estimate, but about 15% of Minnesota's private forest land is in these small ownerships. And I think there's a need and an opportunity for arborists and people like them. Well, really, maybe I should just say for convergence from forestry into what arborists are typically doing, managing trees and smaller properties to meet the needs of this in-between land. There are a few obvious examples. Oak wilt treatments. I look at places like Ham Lake and a little bit north of there, what we might think of as the wildland-urban interface near the Twin Cities. We see oak wilt becoming more and more common there, and treatments like this can help resolve it. This is not that novel. This has been happening for a long time, but I think that there may be opportunities for more of this kind of work and for people to fill a gap in treating these 5, 10, 15-acre parcels that are kind of woods, but not forests. Another opportunity I really see is creating and maintaining defensible space. I think this idea of kind of property management to anticipate and prepare for threats like we saw in the Greenwood Lake fire just a couple of weeks ago. It's not completely suppressed yet or out yet, but there are plenty of pretty dramatic pictures like the one you see on the left, about managing 3, 4, or 5 acres around a house lot to keep keep fire away. And also maintain a defensible space so firefighters can get in and defend that parcel, that property. And I think there's an opportunity to offer more of these services. I do think that there's some demand. I took this picture a couple of days ago. This is the kind of thing that the Greenwood Lake fire was burning through. It's balsam fir that was killed by spruce budworm. And I mean, you can just imagine, my goodness, drop a cigarette or a match under those trees and you better get out of the way pretty quickly. These things just rip through. So my point here, you all know the sort of urban forestry realm better than I do, but I think that there are some good opportunities here to expand. And I think there's a real need for us to expand to be able to offer services within this wildland-urban interface. Success stories, this is a parcel, a 5-acre parcel near Two Harbors that looked like that before. That's Tim Burns, the fellow in the white t-shirt in the middle. He's with the Lake County Soil and Water Conservation District. We can get these 5 and 10-acre parcels managed if we get serious about it and focus on making it happen. Summary, forests are important and they're changing. Invasive threats, climate, global markets, all sorts of things are leading to that change, fire suppression, other things. Active management really is crucial to maintain healthy, productive forests. And I think that there's both a need and an opportunity for us to innovate the way we get the work done. Again, focusing on that kind of land in between. That concludes my presentation. I'm really glad to see a question from Dana. And I guess I'll leave the link to the slides and my contact information if anyone wants to reach out. But Dana, I'll take your question first. I really appreciate the question. Are you saying that it's best from a carbon reduction perspective to harvest forests? No, I'm definitely not saying that. That statement is not wholly false. It's certainly not wholly true. It's much more complicated than that. I do absolutely see a role, and I'm kind of, I don't know if I'm in the minority, but you don't hear people talking about this quite as much. I definitely do see a role for harvesting as part of a not carbon reduction, as part of a plan to sequester and store carbon as quickly and as fully as we can, using natural climate solutions and particularly forests. So I think sometimes we think just, oh, let's grow as much carbon as we can. Let's get as many big, fat, carbon heavy trees in the woods as we can. And then that's the end of the story. But we know ecologically that those trees are going to die. They're going to fall over. They're going to reduce. They're going to release that carbon over time, and their growth rate, which means their carbon sequestration rate, really plateaus as stands get older. So absolutely, we need to leave a lot of old stands intact on the landscape. But harvesting some of those stands to get that growth rate of the next stand really on a rapid upward trajectory is also part of the solution. And I think I definitely do agree with that. Jill, what's the best way to replicate the effects of a fire in a forest without actually setting a fire? That could very easily be the topic of its own talk. Timber harvesting is probably the best way to do that. Fires produce a couple of different effects. They change the properties of the surface soil through the effects of the heat. They, of course, change the light environment by removing most of the intact dominant vegetation. They change nutrient dynamics. They change the seed bed environment and seed availability because the trees, some of the seed would be incinerated. We can't replicate all of that with a timber harvest. The soil doesn't change in the same way. Many of those things don't change in the same way. Fire also incinerates a lot of pathogens and fungal diseases, as I talked about earlier. So timber harvesting is not a perfect substitute by any means, but you asked about the best one, and I think that might be, I can't think of a better way to replicate those effects. Even better would be a timber harvest followed by a prescribed burn, but you said without actually setting a fire. So I don't know if that counts or not.
Yeah, that's great information, Eli. Thank you so much. Really great presentation, a lot of good information. I just want to point out, for those of you who haven't opened up the chat, I just posted all the different links that Eli has been talking about throughout, including some of the earlier ones and including the link to his slides. And Ryan just posted the link for those of you that are looking for ISA CEUs. And I'm going to post a few other links here just so you've got them if you joined a little bit later. There's the MSA Fall Conference. Someone just asked, how can you view this presentation again? Well, we're recording this presentation. You can view it on our YouTube channel, as well as all the other MnSTAC posts and forums that we've been doing. And you can subscribe to that channel. I just put the link in the chat here. And if you're new to MnSTAC or you're just joining, there's also, I'll put the link for MnSTAC in, where you can look on the website, join the newsletter, and you'll find out about other forums that we're running. And if you've just got other information that you're looking for on urban forestry, you can check out trees.umn.edu. And I want to thank Eli again. We're at the end of our time together today, but thank you again, Eli. It was really a wonderful presentation. We appreciate you joining us this morning.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation, Eric.
All right. Have a great afternoon and rest of your morning, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Bye-bye.